like Ava Marie, I was going to also start with a little complaint about the title I was given, because I actually wanted to see
Why did you all wait until today to complain? You've had weeks.
I actually wanted to see a question mark after smart borders, because I think the jury is still out on quite how smart a proposal they are, or maybe. Now, when we analyse these kinds of EU proposals, it tends to be through the prism of security versus liberty, i.e. do the perceived benefits of smart borders justify the perceived restriction on human rights? And what I like to do instead is to sort of try to put the development of smart borders into a broader historical framework and think about some of the wider consequences in terms of threats and trends which ETTIS is concerned about. For those of you not familiar with the Smart Borders proposals, they consist of 3 interlinked initiatives. First is an entry-exit system that will harvest the biometrics and record the arrival and departure of hundreds of millions of third-country nationals coming into and out of the EU every year. The second component is a registered travellers programme, and this will enable what are called bona fide travellers, pre-vetted travellers, to enter the EU more quickly. And this is geared towards business travellers and high-value tourists. And the third component is automatic border control gates, ABC gates, and these allow the documentation, checks and fingerprinting to be done by machines instead of people. The Smart Borders proposals are thus extremely ambitious, highly technical and very expensive, which in the EU context are all things that should set alarm bells ringing. Now, anyone who's done a European Studies course will know that there are at least 2 possible explanations for all forms of European integration. There's a realist political one, and there's a functionalist practical one. Now, in terms of realism, if we look at the development of the Smart Borders proposal, it appears that the catalyst was the arrival of about 25,000 Tunisians in Italy in the spring of 2011, people fleeing the turmoil and the upheaval of the so-called Arab Spring. And it was deemed that the risk of these people overstaying the temporary visas that the Italians had granted them and making their way to France in particular was so great that some kind of sweeping new countermeasures were required. And if we're talking about sort of real politics, we should also remember that these demands came primarily from Nicolas Sarkozy, who was clearly playing the migration card to an electorate he feared might prefer the far right. Now, we might question whether this was an appropriate response in the light of the EU's obligations to refugees under international law and indeed the principles and values espoused in the European treaties. If we consider the role of various member states in propping up the dictators of North Africa and selling them the technologies to brutalise their own populations, you'd have thought that as a territory of 500 million people, we could probably accommodate a few thousand people fleeing out of fear and desperation, but sadly the political realities of the way immigration debates are framed mean that those kinds of conversations have now become impossible. And I'm going to come on to why shortly. So that's the realist perspective. Can you pass me some water, Si?
I can.
Thank you. Cheers. Now, from a functionalist perspective, a kind of different set of explanations for the Smart Border proposals appear. And this requires us to take a sort of longer-term perspective. And what we see if we do that is we find that elements of the Smart Borders proposal have actually been around for the best part of a decade. The idea of an entry-exit system was first floated as part of the deliberations on the visa information system. That is the system under which all visa applicants, with the exception of our friends from the whitelist countries, which happen to have predominantly white populations, all visa applicants are fingerprinted and registered prior to their arrival as part of the visa application process. We also find that the EU now also fingerprints all irregular migrants and all applicants for asylum as part of the Eurodac system. And so we might reasonably deduce from this that the primary rationale for the European entry-exit system is to ensure that all non-EU nationals are fingerprinted either before they enter, when they arrive, or when they're detected in the EU. And in this context, the Smart Borders proposals are really just the latest manifestation of the mania, or the fetishisation, as Mark called it, for biometrics that has really gripped the EU for the best part of 2 decades. It's also important to think about this from a security perspective and point out that this planned entry-exit system cannot actually prevent the problem it perceives to address, which is people overstaying their visas. All it can really do, under the current proposals, is identify people who've overstayed at the point at which they try to leave the EU, by which time it's effectively too late to prevent the immigration infraction that it's supposed to address. So suddenly a new justification appeared from the Commission. They said, well, you know, the EES will at least help us provide statistics and collate data about patterns of overstaying. Now, my guess is that this will confirm that it's actually Australians and Americans who are probably the biggest group of overstayers. But regardless, at well over €1 billion, this does seem like a rather expensive way of collating migration statistics, given current constraints on Europe's public policy budgets. From a law enforcement perspective, it makes a lot more sense to link the proposed new systems to the existing systems, so that if someone doesn't leave when they're supposed to leave and that their exit can't be verified by the new technology, an alert is automatically issued to all police forces through the Schengen Information System. This is basically a de facto arrest warrant. Now, the proposed EU legislation stops well short of this, but I'm absolutely convinced that this is the destination of the proposal. You can imagine a future in which handheld fingerprint scanners already linked to EU-wide police and immigration databases, and this already happens in practice with regards to the SIS, can then be used to detect overstayers during routine police checks on suspicious persons. Now, this will require a good degree of what's called function creep. Why are we sure that this function creep is going to occur? Well, each of the large-scale immigration databases established as part of the area of freedom, security and justice has already been significantly extended beyond its primary purpose. Eurodac, the Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System, one after the other, these massive biometric databases that we were told were required solely to enforce immigration law have been handed over to law enforcement agencies in the name of combating crime and terrorism. European Commission's own feasibility study suggests that the entry-exit system is going to be of limited, if any, use in terms of counter-terrorism. Yet before the ink was even dry on the proposal, it's become abundantly clear that law enforcement are going to be given access to this database as well. So I guess my main point is that function creep is now pretty much built in to the EU's border control architecture. Here's another scenario. Once the EU has the capacity to log the movement and collect the fingerprints of all passengers at all airports, how difficult is it going to be to include EU citizens, the only people who are currently excluded from this framework? Now, I'm willing to have a bet with anyone in this room that if the Smart Borders proposal is adopted within a generation, these are exactly the kind of proposals that we're going to be talking about at events like this. Is anyone willing to bet against me? So that's it in terms of the Smart Borders. There you have it, a legitimate response to the overblown migration crisis engendered by the Arab Spring, or part of an insatiable appetite for surveillance, registration, fingerprinting and control. If you're interested in this stuff, I would like to commend this study written by myself and Matthias called Borderline. You'll find it easily on the web. Now, before I finish up, I just want to say a little about the implications of this kind of high-tech approach to migration and counter-terrorism. As I said at the beginning, it's inevitable that the negotiations on the Commission proposal will be very technical. They're going to focus narrowly on the legal implications, proportionality, data protection, law enforcement access, migrants' rights. But I'm equally concerned about the effect that these kinds of policies are having on the psyche of European citizens and the politics of the member states. So if we're going to talk about threats and trends, what sort of questions should we be asking? Well, the EU is suddenly very preoccupied with the electoral success of far-right and fascist parties within Europe. And the cynic in me can't help feeling that this is at least in part because of their vocal opposition to the European Union itself. Now, what the EU has done, and correctly, has linked the growing popularity of the far-right to the economic crisis. And as the EU Fundamental Rights Agency said on the 21st of March, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, austerity is no excuse for racism. Now, this is a worthy claim, but it seems to me that the popularity of the far right is not simply a matter of austerity. For almost 30 years, the EU and its member states have, through their migration policies, endorsed the premise that migrants are a threat to public security, that they are working illegally at the expense of European citizens, that billions of pounds of high-tech gadgetry is needed to deal with migration, and of course that unlawful migration is explicitly linked to the threat of terrorism. Now, these messages are relentless. They're used to justify repressive laws, they're repeated daily on our televisions, and they are played out on our streets and at our borders. And I would ask all of you in this room, when was the last time you saw a white person getting searched at customs? So when the far right pick up and run with these messages that are coming almost weekly from EU and national governments, that illegal immigration is a security threat of the utmost importance, requiring ever more resources to be deployed against migrants and refugees, it seems a little disingenuous to me to lay the blame solely at the door of austerity. And the problem I think that we face in terms of social cohesion, the divisions, the polarisations of our society, the success of the far right, it doesn't really end with the doctrine around illegal immigration. And scholars like Arun Kundnani are beginning to explore the way in which official counter-terrorism and security narratives are unwittingly feeding into a new form of counter-jihadist far-right mobilisation and racial violence. Have I got a minute just to conclude on this stuff? I've got to stop there. Okay, this is a complex and nuanced area that's only just beginning to receive the attention that it deserves. But I just want to conclude with a few quotes from Arun's paper. Forgive me for going over. David Cameron's speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 2011, given on the same day that the European Defence League marched through Luton, conveyed the strong sense that Britain was facing a generational problem of jihadist violence because of a legacy of misguided multiculturalist policies that had failed to integrate young Muslims into mainstream society. In this way, the terrorist problem was constructed not as consisting of a few individuals engaged in violence, but as a symptom of a much deeper cultural malaise in the British Muslim population. This implied that the solution must involve not just a focus on a small number of Muslims, but a mobilisation of a broader population to embrace a stronger sense of national identity based on muscular liberalism. And like previous ministerial statements on this issue, Cameron's speech also spelled out that existing conventions of things like multicultural tolerance need to be weakened to deal with the perceived crisis. And we very much see the same kind of rhetoric being used in other EU countries. And what Arun Kundnani does, he provides prima facie evidence that these narratives are really feeding in and appropriated by the likes of not just the European Defence League, but Wilders, the Front National, and a host of other groups sweeping Scandinavia, Central and Eastern Europe. I just want to leave you with two thoughts. Anders Breivik, in the first week of his trial, Anders Breivik's manifesto basically had a lot in common with these counter-terrorism narratives, these new security narratives. And leaving aside all the thousands of pages of deluded conspiracy theory, the major theme of Breivik's manifesto is the argument that multiculturalism has weakened national identity and encouraged Islamist extremism, bringing European nations to crisis point. And as Breivik himself noted in the first week of his trial, this is a view held by the three most powerful politicians in Europe, Sarkozy at that time, Merkel and Cameron. And the uncomfortable truth is that the central plank of this terrorist narrative is shared by heads of Western European governments. begging, I think, quite important questions about how we deal with all this stuff. One final point with glad to hear side. Since 1990, 263 people in Europe have been killed by jihadist violence. In the same period, at least 249 persons have been killed by far-right violence. Now, this would suggest to most social policy theories that these are problems of the same order of magnitude. Yet when you read Europol's situation report on terrorism, threats and trends, what do they say? Far-right violence is a public order problem, we're dealing with it, we've got everything in place, don't worry about it. I'm looking forward to a time that we can have the same conversation about counter-terrorism policy. Sorry for going on so long, sorry, thank you.
Thanks, Ben.